Hi, my name is Jess and welcome to my channel, Reads with a Ravenclaw. Today I'm going to be talking to you about all of the books that I read this July. I'm actually really impressed with the amount I read in July. I think I read 6 books and 1 poetry anthology, which is quite a lot for me. A few of the books I don't have physical copies to actually hold up and show you because I got them out of my local library, so you're just going to have to put up with my face taking up most of the frame for some of the shots. But let's just get in with the reviews. The first book I read this month was Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. I've been eyeing this book up for such a long time just because the premise sounded super cute. Those of you who don't know, Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda is about a young guy called Simon. He is gay and he is messaging another boy online, and they've kind of got this flirty banter going on online. Simon is considering but has not yet come out to his friends and family, and this puts him in a very horrible situation when one of his classmates starts blackmailing him with the knowledge of his sexuality and of his messages to this anonymous guy called Blue. I know that that sounds like quite a sinister premise, and it is quite a horrible, cruel situation that Simon finds himself in, but generally this book is actually really cute. For a lot of the book we don't know who this boy that Simon is messaging is, we don't know who Blue is, and that gives this kind of whole book this really cute mystery vibe to it. I've heard it compared to You've Got Mail, and I think that's quite accurate. It's like an updated version of You've Got Mail, an arguably cuter and more relatable version of You've Got Mail. A lot of the emails that they wrote each other were super flirty, super fun. Sometimes they were so flirty that I just like found myself blushing and I had to put the book down for a minute because they got pretty close to the edge. I also think that Becky Albertalli did a great job with Simon's voice. He has one of the most distinctive and believable voices of a YA protagonist that I've read in a really long time. If I were to make any complaint about this story, I would maybe say that it could be a little bit predictable in places. Whilst in the beginning this kind of who is Blue thing did give the story a lot of tension, I felt that as though it was quite easy to work out who Blue was by sort of the halfway point, and from a lot of the reviews I've seen, quite a lot of people did work out who Blue was, and that didn't necessarily lessen my enjoyment of the book at all, so it's not really a big criticism, because even though you kind of worked out who Blue was, you still wanted to see Simon work out who Blue was. But I do feel like it maybe would have had a more interesting impact had I not worked out who Blue was at all, or at least until later in the novel. Overall though, I thought that this was an absolutely winning book, and if you're a fan of rom-coms or like romance comedy YA, I would highly recommend it. And I ended up giving this book 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins, and this was a reread because I've actually read this book once or twice before. Anna and the French Kiss follows the story of a girl named Anna who is sent by her rich novelist father to spend her senior year at a school for Americans in Paris. There she develops this massive crush on a guy called Etienne St. Clair, and the entire book is kind of following their relationship and how it plays out. Reading one of Stephanie Perkins' books is like going to Disneyland for a day, and that is the best way that I can think to describe it. It is just undiluted, pure fun and happiness, and I'm smiling giddily every single time I read one of her books. Out of the 3 novels that Stephanie Perkins currently has out, all of them being in the romance genre, Anna and the French Kiss is definitely my favourite because I think its setting is the strongest. The way that Stephanie Perkins writes about France is really wonderful. She just brings it to life and you really feel like you were there with Anna. I also think that she writes boys incredibly. She writes the kind of boys that you know probably don't exist but you really hope do. I love Etienne St. Clair with, like, you know, a passion, honestly. I also think that Anna is really likeable and the pacing of the book is really good. I think the thing that I love the most about Anna and the French Kiss, however, is that it just allows itself to be a really good romance novel. I think my problem a lot of the time, especially with YA contemporary, is it tries to push through this huge message, and that can sometimes make it feel really preachy and just take away a lot of the enjoyment for me. Whereas Anna and the French Kiss just embraces how fun it is, and it knows how fun and romantic and dreamy it is, and it doesn't try to convert that into something super preachy, and I really appreciate that about this book. This is a super enjoyable book, and I would again really recommend this if you're looking for a really cute summer romance, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read, I actually have a copy to show you of, and that is Lips Touch by Laini Taylor, and this is a short story collection. It's got 3 short stories in it, and it follows just how kisses can impact things. All of them revolve around some form of kiss. Laini Taylor's books and I have a very interesting relationship. I am always absolutely just blown away by her prose. I think her writing is gorgeous, and I think it is at its most gorgeous perhaps in this short story collection because everything is so expertly crafted. But for some reason I'm always left wanting more in terms of character, and I definitely felt that this book was no exception to that. Like I said, the writing was absolutely gorgeous. Laini Taylor draws on all these different types of mythology, and just that blend of myth and magic and her gorgeous writing style creates like this really great atmosphere around the short stories, but I just didn't feel convinced a lot of the time by characters. Having said that, the first short story of this novel, which I believe is called Goblin Fruit, has probably my favourite character in any Laini Taylor novel, which is a young woman called Kizzy. I think that she's really well characterised, but the rest of the characters in the novel didn't really convince me as much as Kizzy did. I would definitely recommend this if you've liked Laini Taylor's other books. If you like the sort of atmosphere maybe of Maggie Stiefvater's Raven Cycle as well, I think you could really like this. But overall, I was just kind of iffy about it, and I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read this month was The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. This book follows a young woman called Nella Ortman who in 1686 travels to Amsterdam to live with the wealthy merchant that she has just married, Johann Brandt. As a wedding gift, Johann gives her this like cabinet replica of the house that they are living in, and she starts writing to a miniaturist to ask for these little like miniature furnishings to put in this dollhouse. However, things get a bit creepy and a bit eerie when some of the little figures that are delivered to Nella start to reflect or symbolise events that are really going on in her life, and she starts to fear and question who this miniaturist is. This book is another one that I kind of had mixed feelings about. Some parts of it I absolutely adored, some parts of it I was kind of like meh about really. I think this book does suspense really well. I started reading this on the plane on the way to holiday, and I just could not stop for that entire plane ride because what Jessie Burton, forgot her name now, what Jessie Burton does really well is she sets up these scenarios and these questions and these loose threads that are so interesting that you just want to know what happens, and so you keep reading. And so I found just the suspense of it, the tension around the story and the plot to be really, really fun and entertaining. It's also got a really unique and original premise, and I loved watching that play out. I also really like the setting of late 1600s Amsterdam. I really love reading books with settings that aren't often portrayed in literature, and I think that Amsterdam's one of them. The only book that I can think of that I've read that takes place in Amsterdam is that like tiny section of The Fault in Our Stars when they're in Amsterdam. So this was really like refreshing and unique. However, I've also heard people say that the setting is not necessarily convincing, and whilst I cannot comment on that as a historian, I did find it quite strange that Nella was sometimes so forward, and I did sometimes wonder if maybe Jessie Burton has written a protagonist that is slightly too 21st century for 1600s Amsterdam, although that is just like a general impression I've had, and like I've said, I'm not a historian, so I can't confirm whether or not that's true. I also feel like this book ended a bit abruptly and maybe too vaguely in places, and whilst I'd started this book and been really excited by it, I therefore like finished it and just felt kind of let down. Ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next thing that I read is a poetry anthology of which I do not have a copy currently here with me, and it is called Beauty Beauty by Rebecca Perry. It's hard to pin down specifically what this anthology is about. It looks a lot at love, it looks a lot at heartbreak, it uses intertextuality a lot, and it integrates a lot of history. A lot of the poems are kind of put on the page in quite a unique formation and structure, and there are gaps, and I think that makes it very visually arresting. I really enjoyed this poetry anthology. Like I said, because I don't have a current copy here with me now, I can't give like specific quotes to you, but I do remember when I was reading it, there were sometimes just these lines that were just so beautiful to say. Like the language was gorgeous, the sounds were gorgeous, and I really think that Rebecca Perry just did a really good job of just creating these beautiful words. And like I said, I think that the structure just adds to that and makes it just look like a really interesting piece of work. And I ended up giving the poetry anthology a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I'm a huge fan of the Game of Thrones TV show, as are my parents, which is kind of awkward sometimes because if any of you have watched Game of Thrones, just imagine watching that with your parents. Yeah, A few weeks ago, before season 7 started, I was getting like withdrawal symptoms and I was feeling so hyped up, and when I found this in a charity shop for super cheap, I thought I'm just gonna read it and try and quell some of those, quell that need that I feel to be back in Westeros. I think I've got to give George R.R. Martin respect and praise for the way that he's dealt with this massive land of Westeros. I think it's so impressive just how deep he's gone in his world building and also in his character building. This book famously has so many characters, yet I feel like J.K. Rowling, he does a really good job with giving even minor characters these little traits that make them memorable. The main problem that I have with this book, and it's actually a really interesting kind of dilemma to me, is that I felt like in terms of fantasy, it wasn't necessarily anything particularly special. And I'm not saying that this doesn't deserve its status as one of the fantasy giants, because it absolutely does, but a lot of the aspects of this book are things that I have seen before in fantasy novels. It makes use of a very typical setting, and just because of how typical the setting is, a lot of the aspects of this book just felt so familiar to me and felt like I'd seen them done before. Whereas in the TV show, because we don't really see high fantasy portrayed as often in television, especially not on the scale that Game of Thrones is, the TV show feels like endlessly, innovative and interesting. And that makes the issue that I had with this book really interesting, because for a fantasy book, whilst this is, amazing in scope and in skill, it could be considered generic, whereas the TV show, which is based on this book, is something that's really not very generic at all for TV. So yeah, I do prefer the TV show, but I did really enjoy my foray into the Game of Thrones universe, and I am considering continuing this, although it is a massive commitment because all of the books are huge and the last 2 aren't out yet. But I ended up giving this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. And the final book I read this month was another reread because I just couldn't resist, and it is The Piper's Son by Melina Marchetta. I mentioned her so many times before in this channel, so if you've been watching my videos at all, you will know that Melina Marchetta is my favourite young adult author of all time. Piper's Son follows Tom, who is a character that showed up in one of her previous books, Saving Francesca. He was a minor character in that book, but he's a POV character in this book. And a couple of years before this book starts, Tom's uncle Joe was caught up in a terrorist attack in London and he died. And this has sent Tom's entire family into this downward spiral of grief, and particularly Tom has become very isolated and very lost and has distanced himself from those friends that we see he made in Saving Francesca. This also follows the perspective of his aunt Georgie Finch, who is struggling to navigate this issue of her being pregnant with the child of a man that once cheated on her. She just takes this book that could have so easily been this mess of cliches and drama and makes it something so emotional and poignant and profound. I love the way she looks at family dynamics and family ties and their complexity in this book, because Tom's family has been broken by this incident, but they also need each other to get over this incident, and that sort of dynamic is just really interestingly played out. I also think it's really interesting to pair Tom's voice, and Tom's in his early 20s, he's 21 I think in this book, with the voice of Georgie Finch, who is in her 40s, because you have these two different kind of generational perspectives that just make for a really, really interesting read. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. I don't think there has been a Melina Marchetta book, or will ever be a Melina Marchetta book, that I will not give 5 out of 5 stars to. Okay, so those are all of the books that I read this month. I know that this wrap up was super long and I'm sorry about that, but I read so much and I just wanted to talk about all of it. I'd really like to know what books you've been reading this month, so leave a comment down below, but until next time, thank you for watching and goodbye.